There was a night many years ago when a man came to my consulting room with eyes that no longer belonged to him. He had built everything a man is told to build: a marriage, a fortune, a reputation that walked into rooms before he did. And yet, when he sat down across from me, he confessed something the world would never have suspected. He said, "Doctor, I have forced my entire life into existence, and now I cannot feel any of it." I remember the silence that followed his words, because in that silence I heard something I had heard 1,000 times before. It was the quiet collapse of a soul that had spent decades pushing against a river that was never meant to be pushed. The old Germans had a phrase for this, and it has haunted me since I first heard it whispered in the alpine villages of my childhood: Erzwinge, nichts, force nothing, let God guide you. It was not a religious instruction, not in the way the modern mind imagines religion. It was a psychological law older than any church. It was a recognition that there is something within us and around us that knows the way better than a small frightened self that calls itself I. But modern man has forgotten this. He has built temples to his own will and called them success. And then he wonders why the gods of his dreams have turned their backs on him. I have spent my life watching what happens to the human psyche when it refuses to listen. I have watched brilliant men crack open from the inside because they could not stop pushing. I have watched gentle women become hard as granite because they were taught that softness was failure, and in every case the wound was the same. They had stopped trusting the deeper current. They had mistaken the ego's panicked grasping for the soul's true direction. And the longer they forced, the further they drifted from the very thing they were trying to reach. What I want to speak about now is not a philosophy. It is a way of standing inside your own life. It is the difference between a man who lives and a man who is merely lived by his compulsions. And I must warn you, what mythology has been trying to tell us for centuries about this very subject is far stranger and far more demanding than the comforting words you may have heard before. The conscious mind, what you call yourself, is only a small island floating upon a vast and ancient ocean. Beneath the surface of your awareness lives a kingdom older than your memory, older than your language. I have called this the collective unconscious, and within it dwell the great archetypal forces: the mother, the hero, the shadow, the self. These are not metaphors. They are living psychic realities. They speak to you in dreams. They move through you when you fall in love. They rise up when you stand at the edge of a cliff and feel something pulling you back from death. The ego, this small island, makes a fatal mistake when it begins to believe it is the whole ocean. It looks around at the world and decides that everything must be controlled, arranged, forced into the shape it desires. It schedules its happiness. It maps out its future with the precision of an engineer, and for a time it appears to work. The man climbs the ladder. The dream is purchased with great effort. But then, almost without warning, the ground shifts. A depression descends without reason. A marriage that was supposed to be eternal collapses overnight. A career that was supposed to bring fulfillment leaves nothing but ashes in the mouth. And the ego stands bewildered, asking, "But I did everything right. Why has it all fallen apart?" The answer is one the ancient ones knew, and that we have forgotten at our peril. The self, the true center of the psyche, the imago Dei within, does not bow to the ego's plans. It has its own plan, its own timing, its own intelligence. And that intelligence is incalculably older and wiser than the small calculating mind that tries to override it. When you force, you are not building. You are tearing the fabric of your own psychic ecology, and the consequences always arrive, even if they arrive late. Here begins the darkest game of the unconscious. The harder you push against your nature, the more violently your nature pushes back. I have seen men who force themselves into the wrong careers wake up at 50 with illness blooming in their bodies. I have seen women who force themselves into marriages of convenience develop strange paralysis. Depressions no pharmaceutical could touch. The body knows, the unconscious knows. And what the conscious mind refuses to acknowledge, the deeper layers will eventually scream. The alchemists, Those strange medieval philosophers whom history has dismissed as mere chemists understood something profound about this. They spoke of the opus, the great work, the transformation of base matter into gold. But the true alchemists were not concerned with metals. They were concerned with the soul. And they taught a principle the modern mind cannot tolerate. They taught that the work happens by itself. The prima materia, the raw stuff of the soul, must be placed into the vessel, sealed and then left alone. The fire must do its work. Time must do its work. The mysterious agency they call the Mercurius must do its work. The alchemist's task was not to force the transformation. It was to provide the conditions and then to wait. We have lost this art entirely. We are a civilization that cannot wait. We cannot sit with discomfort. We cannot endure the long silences in which the soul speaks. And so we force our children to become what we wished we had been. We force our bodies beyond their natural rhythms. We force love where there is no love. And we force success where there is no genuine calling. And we wonder why anxiety has become the great plague of our time. But the most surprising part is yet to come, because the wisdom of Erzwinge nichts is not a passive surrender. This is a great misunderstanding. When I say force nothing, let God guide you, I am not saying lie down and do nothing. That would be its own kind of disease, the disease of the poor eternus, the eternal child who refuses to engage with life at all. What I am pointing toward is far more subtle. It is the art of right action, the action that flows from the deeper self rather than from the panicked ego. It is what the Taoists call Wu Wei, effortless action, action that aligns with the grain of reality rather than against it. I once treated a young painter who came to me in despair. He had been working for years on a single series of paintings, forcing himself through every block, every quiet voice within him that said, wait. By the time he reached my office, he could no longer hold a brush without his hand trembling. I told him to stop, not for a day, not for a week, but for as long as it took. I told him to walk in the forests, to dream, to sit by water. He looked at me as if I had asked him to die. For 3 months he did nothing. He thought he was wasting his life. And then on a morning in late autumn, he sat down at his easel, almost by accident, and he painted something he had never imagined himself capable of painting. He told me later that it felt as though his hand was being moved by another. He said, I was not the one painting. Something was painting through me. This is what the old masters knew. There is a deeper agency, and it can only emerge when the small self stops blocking the door. The Greeks called this daimon. The Romans called it genius, not in the modern sense of intellectual brilliance, but as a literal, accompanying spirit, the inner guide assigned to each soul at birth. The Christians called it the Holy Spirit, or providence, or grace. The Sufis called it the beloved, the inner friend who whispers from behind the veil. In every authentic spiritual tradition, the same recognition appears. You are not alone in there. You are accompanied. And the great task of life is not to dominate this companion with the ego's plans, but to learn to listen, to follow. The person who has begun to live by this principle becomes strangely uncoupled from the desperate urgency that grips most modern people. They are not lazy. They are not passive. They work, and often with great intensity. But there is no panic in their work. There is no white-knuckled grip on outcomes. They have learned to ask, before every major decision, a different question than the ego asks. The ego asks, how can I make this happen? The deeper self asks, what is trying to happen through me? The detail most people overlook hides precisely here. There is a profound difference between these two questions. The first treats life as a problem to be conquered. The second treats life as a mystery to be entered. The first assumes that you know what you need. The second admits that what you truly need may be beyond your current understanding. And in my long career, I have observed without exception that the deepest fulfillments in human life arrive only through the second question. This brings me to something I have hesitated to speak about, because it is so easily misunderstood. The principle of Erzwinge nichts requires a relationship with what I can only call the religious function of the psyche. I do not mean institutional religion. I do not mean dogma. I mean the deep human capacity for relationship with that which transcends the ego. The modern mind has tried to dispose of this function. It has declared that God is dead, that mystery is superstition, that everything can be reduced to neurochemistry. And we are now living through the consequences. When the religious function is suppressed, it does not vanish. It cannot vanish because it is structural to the psyche itself. It simply migrates. The modern man, having killed his gods, now worships his work, his image, his political ideology, his romantic partner, his bank account. He demands that these things provide him with the meaning, the transcendence, the salvation he once sought from God. And of course they cannot. They were never designed to. And so he becomes increasingly desperate, increasingly forceful, because the thing he is trying to extract from finite objects is infinite. And no amount of forcing will make a finite thing yield an infinite gift. What I observed across decades of clinical work is deeply unsettling. I have not met a single person in the second half of life whose fundamental problem was not religious in nature. By this, I did not mean they needed to attend church. I meant they had lost their relationship with a deeper guiding intelligence within themselves. They had become amputated from the self. The man who forces is the man who has lost trust. He believes that if he does not push, nothing will happen. He believes the universe is hostile, indifferent, mechanical, and that his ego is the only intelligent agent in the field. This is a profoundly lonely position, and it is the source of the great misery of our age. To recover from this position is the work of a lifetime. It cannot be done quickly, and it cannot be done by force, which is itself a kind of cosmic joke. You cannot force yourself to stop forcing. You cannot will yourself into surrender. The ego, when it tries to imitate surrender, only creates a new mask, a spiritual persona, a performance of letting go that is in fact one of the most cunning forms of grasping. I have seen many seekers caught in this trap. They read the books, they speak the right words, but underneath, the same desperate clutching continues, only now disguised in spiritual language. True surrender is not something the ego performs. It is something that happens to the ego, often through suffering, often through the collapse of some grand plan the ego had been protecting for years. The old mystics spoke of the dark night of the soul, that terrible passage in which everything the self has built begins to dissolve. They did not welcome it, but they recognized it as the doorway through which the deeper life enters. The Negredo, the alchemists called it, the blackening, the necessary death of the old order so that something truer may be born. Consider the great pattern that mythology repeats in every culture, in every era. The hero leaves home. He is called to an adventure he did not choose. He resists. He is forced through circumstantial suffering to accept the call. He descends into the underworld. There he encounters his shadow, his deepest fears. He nearly dies. And then, through no power of his own, he is transformed. He emerges with a gift, an elixir, a treasure, a wisdom that he could never have obtained by force, only by submission to the descent. This pattern is the deepest map of the human soul's development. The treasure is found only through the surrender. The kingdom is entered only through the dying. The real turning point begins right here. Because once you understand this pattern, you begin to see your own life differently. The crises that arrived without your permission begin to look less like punishments and more like invitations. The plans that fell apart begin to look less like failures and more like redirections. The loves that ended begin to look less like tragedies and more like passages. You begin to develop what the old traditions called a religious attitude, a way of standing inside your life that recognizes you are not the only agent at work. There is a story unfolding through you that is larger than you, and your task is not to dominate the story, but to participate in it. I want to be precise about what this does not mean, because the temptation towards spiritual passivity is great. Erzwinge nichts does not mean abandoning responsibility. It does not mean drifting through life waiting for signs. The man who lives by this principle is in many ways more decisive than the man who is constantly forcing. The difference lies in the source of the action. The forcing man acts from fear, from compulsion, from the panicked ego trying to control outcomes. The surrendered man acts from a deeper place, a place of listening, where the action arises out of attunement with what the moment is actually asking for. There is a German word that captures this, and the alchemists use it frequently. Geschehen lassen, to let happen, not to make happen, not to prevent happening, but to let happen. It is one of the most subtle and difficult arts a human being can develop. It requires a cultivation of a certain inner stillness, a certain capacity to be present without grasping. Every authentic spiritual tradition has at its heart this same recognition. You cannot force the divine. You can only prepare the vessel and then wait. What does it mean to prepare the vessel? This is where the work of individuation begins. The vessel is your psyche. The preparation involves the slow, patient work of becoming conscious, of recognizing your shadow, of dialoguing with your inner figures, of honoring your dreams, of facing the parts of yourself you have rejected. None of this can be forced either, but it can be invited. You can sit with your dreams in the morning, simply allowing them to speak. You can notice the moments when you are about to push against life, and you can pause and ask, what is actually trying to happen here? I remember an old peasant woman I once met in a remote village in the Engadine. She had no education, but she possessed a wisdom I, with all my degrees, could only approach from a distance. I asked her how she had survived the terrible losses of her life. 3 children dead, a husband lost to the Great War, a farm burned to the ground. She looked at me with eyes that contained centuries, and she said, Doctor, I learned long ago not to argue with God. When the storm comes, you do not stand against it, you bend, and when it passes, you straighten again, and you see what is left, and you build from that. This was not resignation. This was the deepest wisdom I have ever encountered. The modern man cannot bend. He has forgotten how. He sees every storm as a personal affront, every limitation as an insult, every delay as a defeat. He has been taught that he is the master of his fate, the captain of his soul, and while there is a partial truth in this, we are not mere puppets. The much larger truth has been forgotten. We are participants in a process that is far larger than us. We are notes in a symphony we did not compose. Our task is not to drown out the symphony with our own forced melody. Our task is to find our true note and to sound it clearly when the time comes for it to sound. This is what I mean by individuation. It is not the becoming of an isolated, self-sufficient ego. That is the modern caricature of selfhood, and it leads only to loneliness and exhaustion. True individuation is the long, mysterious process by which a human being becomes who they were always meant to become, not who their parents wanted them to be, not who their culture demanded, but who they truly are, the unique expression of the self that they alone, in all of history, were sent here to embody. And this becoming cannot be forced. It can only be lived. There is a paradox here I must address. The more you surrender to the deeper guidance, the more genuinely individual you become. This contradicts everything the modern mind believes. The modern mind imagines that surrender means losing yourself, becoming a sheep, dissolving into some collective. But the opposite is true. When the surrender is to the inner self rather than to outer powers. The self is the unique pattern of meaning unfolding through your particular life. When you are aligned with it, you become more yourself, not less. The forcing man, by contrast, becomes generic. He becomes one of the many indistinguishable strivers, all running in the same direction for the same prizes, all wearing the same masks. I think now of the figure of the wise old man, the archetype that appears so often in dreams and in mythology, the Merlin, the Lao Tzu, the Khidr of the Sufi tradition, the hidden guide who appears at the crossroads, who speaks in riddles, who points the way but never coerces. This figure lives within you. It cannot be approached through force. It can only be approached through stillness, through listening. Many of my patients would encounter this figure in their dreams. An old man with kind eyes, a figure in a doorway, a voice speaking from a well. And every time he appeared, the same lesson was communicated. Stop pushing. Listen. The way is being shown to you, but you must become quiet enough to perceive it. The deepest reason that forcing fails is not psychological. It is metaphysical. There is woven into the fabric of reality itself a kind of intelligence, a pattern, a logos, the old Greeks called it. The world is not a meaningless mechanism waiting to be shaped by the human will. It is a living order with its own currents, its own seasons. When you force, you are not just damaging yourself psychologically, you are tearing the fabric of a larger meaning that is trying to express itself through you. And reality, in its mysterious way, resists this tearing. It frustrates the forced project. It dissolves the constructed castle. And when this happens, the modern man interprets it as injustice, as bad luck. But it is none of these things. It is the deeper order reasserting itself, calling you back to the path you are meant to walk. I am not asking you to believe this. I am only asking you to consider it and to test it against the evidence of your own life. Look back at the times when you forced something into existence. Look at the costs. And then look at the times when you let something unfold, when you waited, when you listened, when you trusted. Look at what those moments produced. The forced achievements turned to ash. The surrendered openings turned to gold. So what then is the practice? It is not a technique. It is not a method you can master in a weekend workshop. It is a slow reorientation of your entire way of being. It begins with the simple recognition, repeated again and again throughout the day, that you are not the only agent at work in your life. There is something else. Call it God if that word still has meaning for you. Call it the self, call it the Tao, but begin to address it. Begin to listen for it. Begin to ask, before you launch into another forced campaign, where is the grain of this moment, and how can I act with it rather than against it? This is the most important question a modern person can ask. And the strange thing is that the more you ask it, the more you begin to receive answers, not in voices, not in visions, though sometimes these come too, but in subtler ways, a sudden clarity about a decision, an unexpected meeting that turns out to be exactly what you needed, a dream that reveals what your conscious mind could not see, a small voice within that says, wait, not yet, or now, go now, this is the moment. The deeper guidance is constantly trying to reach you. It has never stopped. The only question is whether you will quiet the forcing mind long enough to perceive what is already being offered. I am an old man now, and I have walked this path for many decades. I have made my share of forced choices, and I have suffered the consequences. I have also learned, slowly and with great difficulty, to bend, to listen, to trust. And what I can tell you, from the far end of a life devoted to this question, is that the trust is not misplaced. The deeper intelligence is real. It does not always give you what you want, but it gives you what you need to become who you truly are. And there is no greater gift than this, to have lived your own life, to have sounded your own note in the great symphony, to have allowed the divine spark within you to express itself in the unique form it was meant to take. So I leave you tonight with no instruction, no commandment, no easy answer. I leave you only with a question, and with the suggestion that you carry this question into the days ahead and let it work on you. When was the last time you stopped forcing? When was the last time you sat quietly and listened for what was already trying to emerge through you? What might your life become if you trusted even a little more the deeper current that has been carrying you all along beneath all your plans and all your fears, and see what begins to flow toward you when you finally let it?